Welcome to the Infowars Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Monday, January the 20th, 2014. And in our top story today, we find that the Department of Homeland Security is giving the Muslim Brotherhood VIP treatment. This is an exclusive story by Paul Joseph Watson. A newly released document obtained via Freedom of Information request says that members of a Muslim Brotherhood delegation traveling through Minneapolis Airport, New York's JFK Airport, and Dulles Airport were handed expedited entry known as, quote, port courtesy, unquote, which is normally reserved for high-ranking government officials and dignitaries. And of course, at the time, they didn't have anybody that was even elected in Egypt, so they can't make the claim that that was the case, that they were being given treatment because they were associated with a government. But we've seen this happening over and over again. And we know from internally released TSA documents that came out during a lawsuit that as far back as 2011, they admitted internally that there were no threats at the airports or against airplanes. And yet they subject all of us to this kind of treatment as if we were terrorists. But when we have the Muslim Brotherhood coming in, they get the VIP treatment. Just amazing. But look at what else is happening with CIA terror-sponsored groups. Kurt Nemo's article on Infowars.com says CIA-connected terror group issues threat ahead of Russian Olympic Games. Now, these people put a video up on YouTube that has now since been taken down, but they said the men warned that terrorists will attack the Winter Olympics scheduled to begin on February the 6th. And the quote said, "We have prepared a present for you, President Putin, and all those tourists who will come over." Now, as Kurt Nemo points out, this group that put the video up was actually created during the Second Chechen War. They're loyal to a Chechen commander who was indoctrinated and trained by the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence in Coast Afghanistan at a camp that was set up in the early 1980s by the CIA and ISI and run by an Afghan warlord who was funded by the CIA and the Afghan drug trade. Now, remember back to the Boston bombing, we found out that Uncle Ruslan had connections to Graham Fuller, who was the CIA head in that area and was involved with Chechen rebels. This is what Graham Fuller said about the role of Chechen rebels and Islam terrorists. He said, "The policy of guiding the evolution of Islam and of helping them against our adversaries worked marvelously well in Afghanistan against the Russians. The same doctrines can still be used to destabilize what remains of Russian power, especially to counter the Chinese influence in Central Asia." Now, we also know that Prince Bandar had threatened Putin. It was reported by a Muslim paper over his opposition to the Syrian war. They threatened him with violence at the Olympic Games. So these connections with the CIA and Chechen terrorists, as well as the threats of Prince Bandar, are very concerning. It could be something that, if there is an attack there at the Olympic Games, that could be something to further martial law in the United States. Now, we also see that both China and Iran are preparing new weapons. Now, Paul Joseph Watson is reporting that China is preparing to target U.S. aircraft carriers with a new hypersonic missile that they just tested. He says China's new hypersonic missile vehicle is primarily designed to target U.S. aircraft carriers. Military expert Chen Hu told the state-run Chinese Central Television, and yet another admission of Beijing's increasingly hostile geopolitical posturing. Now, this is the Wu-14, a hypersonic glide vehicle, which can penetrate missile defense systems by traveling at up to 10 times the speed of sound. Well, remember back in the 1990s when all the military technology was transferred to the Chinese, both covertly and overtly by the Clinton administration? Now that they have enhanced capabilities, they're using this now to push for a new arms race here with the military-industrial complex. And we see that another former deputy director of the IAEA is speculating that Iran could be just 2 to 3 weeks away from a nuclear bomb if they don't abide by the new agreement. He says they still have quite a substantial stock of uranium hexafluoride, which is enriched to 20%. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that it's hexafluoride, because one of the reasons we have fluoridation of the water, if you'll remember, is because we're disposing of byproducts of both the aluminum and the nuclear industry. Hexafluoride is something that is used to turn the uranium into a gas so that it can be used in the enrichment process, and the waste product of that is, of course, dumped in our water. Now, we also see global crisis in the financial markets. We have a mega default in China that is looming for January the 31st. Chinese state media reported that China Credit Trust Company warned investors that they may not be repaid when one of its wealth management products matures on January the 31st. And what they did was the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China sold the China Credit Trust product to its customers in the Shaanxi province. Sounds just like America, doesn't it? They dump this stuff before they get stuck with it, and then they disavow any connection to it. Now, this is about $500 million that's going on in China that they're going to stick investors there with. In Germany, we see that Deutsche Bank there is warning that they're having challenges ahead. They're looking at 1.3 billion net loss just last quarter that they're reporting. And New York Times reports that Deutsche Bank, which is the largest investment banking operation in Europe, disclosed a bigger than expected quarterly loss and warned of a difficult year ahead. So we see that the global financial crisis is not anywhere under control. It's moving across. It's in Germany, it's in China. And there's an interesting story that was in Zero Hedge that says Germany has recovered a paltry 5 tons of gold from the New York Fed after a year. They say a year after the Bundesbank announced its stunning decision, driven by Zero Hedge's revelations, to repatriate 674 tons of gold from the New York Fed and the French Central Bank. It had only managed to transfer a paltry 37 tons. And he points out that at that rate, they're not going to be on schedule to get it over the 8 years that they said that they would be able to collect it. And that only the New York Fed had only produced a tiny 5 tons of gold. The rest of it came from the French. Now, that 5 tons of gold is really only about 2/3 of 1% of the amount in question.